Now, welcome back to this tutorial. And today we're going to talk about using explicit cursors in PLSQL. And for this case, we all know that when we talk about cursors, when we talk about cursors in Oracle, it's actually a point in the Oracle database where SQL statements are being processed. And it's actually the work of the Oracle server to operate on these cursors. But in this case, based on the introduction we made on introduction to SPLSQL cursors, we made an introductory where we were able to look at the two types of PLSQL. We have, PLSQL cursors. We have something called the explicit cursors. And again, we have something called implicit cursors. If you remember, without even talking about the cursors, if you remember very well that we have a difference between the implicit and explicit. I know we will encounter the two terms most frequently in PLSQL, but in this case, we can actually say that in short, implicit means it's being done by the system automatically. If we can talk from the Oracle database point of view, then we can say implicit is being done by the Oracle server automatically. Then on the other side of explicit cursors, if we talk about explicit cursors in line with the Oracle database, then of course, it's actually being done by the user, or it's being done by the programmer, which is actually you and me. So explicit, it is you as the programmer who is supposed to do that. And implicit, it means that it is beyond you as a user, but now it's under the domain of the system to now work on that. So when it comes to implicit cursors, we mean, or what we mean is that it is actually the Oracle server engine that actually does these cursors, or actually brings up these cursors. Especially, we have the attributes that are involved on both sides. When we talk about the implicit cursors, we have the implicit cursors attributes. And this involves the three, that is the SQL, the SQL or the SQL. If I can just write it, we have like SQL percent attribute, percent found. We have SQL percent not found. Then we have SQL percent row count. So these are being used by what? These are being used by the system implicitly. So we can say that these are implicit cursor attributes. These are implicit cursor attributes. On the other hand, what are explicit cursor attributes? So for explicit cursor attributes, you can just get rid of what? You can just get rid of this. And I think I mentioned that in the previous video. So you need to have the differences just to know how can we bring up the attributes that are being performed by the system, and how can we bring up the attributes that are being performed by the user. So having said that, I want now us to walk through the explicit cursors, or understand the explicit cursors, because it's actually us who are supposed to bring up this particular type of cursors. Okay. So if I can just increase the font size, let's say to 28, so that we can see what is happening. So when we talk about explicit cursors, as I had said, that the Oracle server uses work areas, and these work areas are referred to as the private SQL areas. This is areas that are being used by the Oracle server. And what is the function? Why is it useful to the Oracle server? So you can say Oracle server uses these areas to do what? These areas to execute SQL statements, and to store. And it's actually a continuation, and to store processing information. So what less about the error, but it's just a continuation, SQL statements and to store processing information. So that is what, let me just clear, that is about the private SQL areas. Now, when we talk about explicit cursor operations, because we don't need to dig more now on the implicit cursors, that one we are leaving it for the system to do the conversion or to do the implementation of the execution. But in this case, we want to concentrate more on understanding the explicit cursor operations, or how does explicit cursor operate. So first of all, you have to declare these explicit cursors in PLSQL when you have a select statement that returns multiple values. Remember, that is the definition of a cursor. So, and you can process each row returned by the select statement. You see, if you want to bring up, if you want to display multiple values, then you have to use the cursor. And how can you display these multiple values? You're supposed to process, or the cursor itself will make sure that each row is processed and returned. Now, the set of rows returned by a multiple row query. Let me repeat. The set of rows returned by a multiple row query is called the active set. The active set. This is the active set. And here I can say, this is the rows, or this is a set of rows returned by a multiple row query. Just understand that, multiple row query. So we have two terms here. One, we have something called the private SQL area that is being used by the Oracle server to process or to execute SQL statements and to store process information. And here again, we have another term, which is active set, which represents a set of rows returned by a multiple row query. For example, if I want to select, let's say select star from from employees, where employee, not even employee, where department. Remember when I apply, or let me just do it practically so that we can see what is happening. For example, after connecting to HR, yeah, let me select. Okay, let's select. Okay, let me have first name, comma salary from employees, where employee ID equals to 100. Okay, let's say 126. You see, and then if I have the same information, where department ID equals to, let's say 90. Now look at that. Based on the two select statements, which one actually displays, or which one has returned a single row and which one has returned multiple rows? So we are talking about the second one, which has qualified to return multiple rows. The first one has only qualified to return a single row. So what happens here? If you are to return multiple rows, this means that we are supposed to use a cursor, so that each line is processed or each row is processed by the select statement. So it will select the first one, then go back, select the second one, then go back, select the third one. If you remember the tutorial we talked about the loops. If you remember PLSQL loops, we did actually talk about how to return multiple rows, or how to generate multiple values. So the same thing happens. So when it comes to the cursor, we are looking at this perspective where we are able to return multiple rows, or how can we return multiple rows. So in this case, I can actually call this an active set, because this is the point where we intend to return multiple row query. Now, what are the functions now of explicit cursors? Number one, explicit cursors can perform row by row processing beyond the first row returned by a query. That means we must have the first row to be returned so that the rest can also be returned. Assume that we have like 10 rows. If the first one is returned, then the system will check for the second one. It will check for the third one. It will check for the 51, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Again, another function is that explicit cursors also keep track of the rows that is currently being processed. So the issue of returning or displaying that particular row is not something that is done automatically by the system, like instantly. It has to be processed. That particular row has to be processed so that it can be returned. And processing involves a lot of things. Again, explicit cursors enable the programmer to manually control explicit cursors in the PLSQL block. So for this case, let me just do this. How can we controlling explicit cursors? So to control explicit cursors, we have like different stages. Number one, we are supposed to declare. See, so we are supposed to declare. Number two, we are supposed to something called open the cursor. You see, so we are supposed to declare, and we are declaring the cursor. So the first one is declare the cursor. Second one is to open the cursor. Third one is to fetch data from the cursor. I will explain it once we have the example from the cursor. The fourth one, sorry, so I'm supposed to give it like that. Then the fourth one is now close the cursor. Close the cursor. So these are the main components of explicit cursors. You must declare, you must open the cursor, you must fetch data from the cursor, you must close the cursor. So what we mean is that in the declarative section, remember declare is actually the declarative section of anonymous block. And in this section, the cursor is being declared. And how can you declare a cursor? You're supposed to declare the cursor by naming it and defining the structure of the query to be associated with it. So what happens is we have the association of the query, the association of the structure of the query to that particular cursor. So here it means that the cursor will act as a temporary container. Remember, it's in line with the variables. So it will act as a temporary container where a query that is meant to display or to return multiple values is. So it means that in the declaration section, it means that we're supposed to declare the cursor by giving a name and again defining the structure, the SQL structure of the query to be associated with it. That is to declare. On the open the cursor, open is the statement or open is the keyword. So this statement, when you talk about open the cursor, it means that the open statement executes the query and binds any variables that are referenced. You see? So once these rows have been identified by the query, we have a term or we have a word to call that, and that is actually referred to as the active set. So once we have that, then it means that our query is ready to be fetched. Our query is ready to be fetched. And now on the fetch data from the cursor, it means that after the data has been opened, after the cursor has been opened, if there are 10 records in that particular query, then it's actually the work of the fetch data from the cursor to capture all the information. So it will test the cursor for any existing row. That is the fetch data from the cursor. So testing of rows within the cursor. Do we have any rows there? If it's a department 90, of course, we have like 3 columns based on the example given. But if it is a department that does not exist, it means that there are no employees in there. So what happens is the cursor will not actually fetch any data from there. It will not fetch any data. But if it's about the department 90, then it means that the cursor will find the number of rows. So if there are no rows to process, then of course the cursor will close, and that is closing the cursor or close the cursor. But if there are rows to be fetched, then the system will try to go back to the open and look for the second row, the third row, the fourth row, until it is over. Once it's over, that means no more rows to be fetched, and that is the point where the cursor will now close. So I want us to understand by using an example and see how we can declare, see how we can open, see how we can close, and yeah. So I want to take you through CLSER. So we want to declare the cursor. Declaring the cursor means we have to start with the word cursor, and then we give the name. Let me give C1. So I can give any name. So for your case, you can also give any name. So for this case, let me just give the name of the cursor in lowercase so that we can identify it. Whatever thing I'm giving in uppercase, it means that it's a reserved keyword. Whatever thing I'm giving in lowercase, it means that it is actually a name which can be changed. Then is. So cursor C1 is. Then I have to select, let's say, for example, I want employee underscore ID. I want first name. Let me have like 3 columns, and I want salary from employees. Where, this case, I want a department. Where department ID, equals to. Let's talk about that. And then, since we have these 3 columns, I need to state their variables. I need to create their variables. So number 1, we're talking about emp number. That is a name of a variable. Then I can just give number. Or you can always even use the percent type if you don't mind. You can just say employees dot employee underscore ID percent type. You see? So this means that the system will automatically define, or the system will automatically assign a data type for you. But since you know the data type, you can still put it number. So let us make it more simple. Let me make it number. And then another one is fname. This one is voucher. Then another one is sal. So this one automatically we know it's a number. Yeah. And then we begin. So all this means that I have successfully managed to declare my cursor in the declaration section. And if you remember, we say that once we were declaring a cursor by naming it. So it means that I have declared by using this cursor keyword, and then I have named it. So my cursor is C1. Or my cursor, you can give it cursor equals to Fred, cursor is equals to Kenya, cursor, country cursor. So as long as you know that name is the name of the cursor. Then we associate the query or the structure of that particular query. And if you look keenly about this query will automatically return multiple rows because we are talking about all the employees details, all the employees coming from this department, given the details up there. So we are done with the declaration section. So the next thing now is to open the cursor. Open C1, you see? So opening the cursor. So it means that I am putting the cursor now ready to be fetched, or I'm trying to activate the active sets, or I'm trying to activate now the query, or to make the query available for fetching now. So here we are no longer talking about this query. Now we are talking about the C1 because we know automatically that C1 is connected to this query. And since cursor is more like a variable, it's being contained. The select statement is being contained within the C1. So now I am already open up, and then I want to fetch. So I'll say fetch C1, fetch C1 into into emp number, into f name, into sal. See, that is how it's supposed to go. So we are fetching everything from that perspective. Then from there, after opening, fetching, then we display. So we need to have dbms underscore output dot put underscore line. Then we can have what? We can have emp number. Yeah, so I can have that. I can even make them appear in different ways, but I can just even bring up so that it becomes clear. F name, then you can have sal. And remember, I forgot even to set server output on. So the display of the output may not be visible, but I have to activate the set server output on. Then from there, we end it. Before ending it, we are supposed to close what? Close cursor, which is C1. And then we end. Then we do that. So for my case, you can see that PLSQL successfully, or procedures is completed. Why? I'm not getting the results because I have not activated the set server output on. So what I will do, set server output on. And then this time round, if I put a / and press that, now you can see that we have 114. This is an employee with 114. That is the employee ID. We have the den. Den is the name, that is the first name, and then we have the 20,000, which is actually the salary. But in this case, I think we have one limitation. We've actually used the cursor, and yet we are not fetching multiple rows. We are not fetching multiple rows. So we've actually fetched only a single row. And remember here, we are not talking about employee ID 114. We are talking about department ID 30. So how can I display now multiple rows? So hidi, let me edit. Okay, so let me reduce. So that you can see, yes, here it is. And what I will do, I'm not able to see. Let me again capture this. Now, let me just, you can also do this. You can also do this just to reduce it. Let's say F name. Let's say sal. You can also have it in one line. You can also have it in one line. So let me save so that you can see. Now you can see we have 114, then 2000. Now, another thing, you can still give space. If you want to give space, you can give space. You can again give space. So this is the space given. So you can still make sure that they are there. So you can see this is space now. So 114, then 20,000. Now, let's come to the point now to make some adjustments here. So here it means that we have managed to query the first one. We will manage to query it to return the first row, although we know that it's not a single employee who is working in department ID 30. So we must have like 2, 3 others or 4, and we want to display them using this cursor. So this means that after the cursor has been opened, after the cursor is opened, you have to put loop. After the cursor is opened, you have to put the word loop. And then at this point, after the fetch, you have to give us the exit strategy. So you have to exit when what? Exit when C1. So I'm putting when C1%. Now we are using what? We are using an explicit attribute, explicit cursor attribute, % not found. So this is the work of the loop. And then from there, you just end loop. So these are just but few things I have added. I have added the loop, I've added exit when, and then I've added end loop. So now let's see. So I'll just go back and save, and then click on that, press that, and look at that. So now we have all these employees being displayed. We have all these employees being displayed. And that is the power of using the explicit cursor. That is the power of using explicit cursor. Now, remember this one is using the explicit cursor. We can also use cursors and records. You see, we can still use cursors and records. And let me just bring that example, how we can automatically connect. So it is very simple. So if we are to define a record based on the select list of columns in an explicit cursor, it is also convenient for us to apply the cursors and the records, or to use both sides. If you remember how to talk about the record attribute, that is the % row type, which allows us or enable us to capture multiple values. So it is actually convenient for, again, for processing of rows, especially for the active asset, because you can simply fetch into the record, and therefore the values of the records are loaded directly into the corresponding fields of the record. So no differences. So we can just type, or we can just ed, let me just ed. So the first one is okay, declare. We have cursor C1 is, we have select, everything is okay. But this part is what I want to change. So instead of you having all this information, why don't I create something called the emp record that is only a single variable? And then I'll just say C1%, then row type. See, I'm associating now the row type attribute to the C1, and all of them will be captured under the emp underscore record. So here it's like you're trying to rewrite your program, or you're trying to write your code to make sure that it is as simple as it is. Then we maintain everything the way it is. But again, where there is a problem or something to be changed is now at the output. Okay, before even the output, we have here again, fetch C1 into what? Into this part. So you have to paste it there, into emp record. And then here you're supposed to paste it again, dot. Here paste it again, dot. Here paste it again, dot. Okay, dot. So you cannot, so we are talking about in emp underscore record, just give us the emp number, which is automatically, no, we are not even having again this, so I'm just going to type directly employee underscore ID. This one is the first underscore name. This one is the salary. Yeah, so you are supposed to type the actual columns. So now if I come back and save, and then close, put that and press enter, now you can see that we have the same information, or we have the same information, but this time around we've involved the cursors and the records. So which one is more simple, or which one is more simpler? So you can decide for yourself. And again, that point again, or that way of doing that, you can also use the cursor for loops. That means you're able to use loops to bring up the same results. So for cursor for loops, you see, when you talk about a loop or a cursor for loop in this case, it's actually a process where rows are being processed, or is a way of processing rows as far as explicit cursor is concerned. And it is always a shortcut because the cursor is opened, a row is fetched once for each iteration in the loop, and the loop exits when the last row is processed, and the cursor is closed automatically. So the same rule applies. The loop itself is terminated automatically at the end of iteration where the last row is fetched. So here it means that The first one, for example, 114 was actually returned. Then the loop will go for the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. Now, if it tries to go for the seventh one, it is blank. So that is the only point where the loop will exit. That is where the point will exit. So here I want to show you one example on how we can do this. So we can maintain everything the way it was. Probably the only thing we can change here is let's have like last name and salary. Last name, okay, let's say last name and hire date. So last name and hire date, remember I'm trying to restructure, and then it's going to be a little bit more simpler. So this time down, I don't want to have the open. So what I will do, I will just have the for, and then I'll just say emp, which is this one. Let me copy, paste it there, and then just say in C1, you see, in C1. Now, again, I think let me get rid of this. I don't need to have this. So I'll just create it automatically from this point, emp underscore record in C1. And this time around, don't put a semicolon, don't terminate it. Then we come to loop, and then this one we don't need. So loop, then dbms underscore. So since we had the last name, let me get rid of this. Let me adjust this to last name. And you can see how simple it is. And then we maintain, its name is hire date. And then of course you end loop. So because we do not have the cursor like opened, then we don't need to close. And this is the simplest we can go. This is the simplest we can work with. Even if I want to change this, my cursor to be like Kenya, then you have to change here, Kenya. And then, yeah, then that is okay. Now let's save it and see what happens. Press that. Yeah, you can see now that we have all this information being displayed. So here you can just use the regular explicit cursor. You can just combine or join the cursors and records together, and then you can still come there and use the cursor for loop. And this is exactly how we do it. So just know that for the attributes to be there, just understand that we have the number of attributes, and again, remember how to use at least one of them. If it's about the percent not found, percent found, if it's about percent row count, you can still use that. And that is about what? Using explicit cursors. So you have to know, like, what is a cursor? How do I bring up the explicit cursors? What is it meant for? And as long as we are able to display multiple rows from a cursor, if you don't involve the loops, then automatically that will not give you any results. But again, you're supposed to assign or to apply the loops so that you can have multiple rows being generated, because you are supposed to declare, supposed to open, supposed to fetch, you're supposed to close the cursor. So if there are no rows to be fetched, then the cursor is going to be closed. The cursor is going to be closed. And that is the end of a simple video or a simple tutorial on explicit cursors. Thank you, and see you on the next tutorial.